privilege to talk to Emery Brown and Rob Kass, two preeminent statisticians and scholars who study brain today here in Boston and San Diego, California. We're going to start with a simple but important question. Rob and Emery, in your view, what are the major current statistical problems in neuroscience? We can start with Emery and then we go to Rob.
Okay, I'll start with one of them and then I'll let Rob fill in and we can probably go back and forth. I think one of the biggest statistical problems in neuroscience right now is we have oceans of data and we do not have enough statisticians intellectually engaged in helping us analyze that. And I think that is problem one right there.
When you say oceans of data, what kind of data are you referring to?
So what I mean is they're data which span the gamut of things which statisticians are familiar with, but probably not familiar with in the neuroscience context because there are not a lot of statisticians who work in neuroscience. So they're data which would be time series like EEG, local field potentials, they're imaging data, they're behavioral data which could be just simple series of yes-no question responses. And then there are things like neurophysiological data which could be like spike trains, which we would think of as point processes. It would be akin to the sorts of things that we would analyze if we're trying to study like earthquake occurrences and these types of things. So there's tons of data, tons of varied data, and we literally do not have enough people to help us analyze them the way we would think about analyzing a statistician.
Rob, what's your...
Yeah, so I mean, I of course agree with everything Emery just said. I would just add one of the points that in fact Emery has pushed, I think, from the very beginning of his efforts, is the dynamic nature of the signals. Brain processes are always evolving over time, and a lot of what you see in the literature is actually static. It's not really taking advantage of the fact that many of the signals that we get have rich time structure to them, and also has a lot of network structure. So the words I would use is dynamic network models or dynamic networks are tools to understand how networks change over time. They could be high dimensional regression, or they could be graphical models. There's lots of things, depending on the situation, different tools that could be applied. But the big point is that there hasn't been enough statistical effort in this direction.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point. It would take us into areas that we don't typically think about, perhaps in our statistics courses. All of us have probably had a course in time series analysis of these sorts of things, and all of us had a course probably multivariate analysis, and then courses which teach graphical models are becoming more and more common. But the needs in neuroscience, as Rob was suggesting, fit at that intersection, where you'd have to have a dynamic, high dimensional, graphical model to really describe a lot of these systems. And that's just not something you can look up in a textbook or just, pull off the shelf somewhere.
So you guys are involved with the Brain Initiative. Would you just tell me, give me a big picture of what this is?
Right, so I was on the working group, the NIH working group, and what the Brain Initiative was a request from President Obama to lay out a framework to put in place the tools that would enable neuroscientists to help advance the field of neuroscience. So the tools being better ways to record from parts of the brain, better ways to identify the cells in the parts of the brain, better ways to analyze those data, and in particular ways of getting people outside of neuroscience involved in the solutions to these problems, in particular statisticians, computational folks, physicists, mathematicians. The idea being, the intent of the Brain Initiative, it's not like what the Human Genome Project was at all. It was to put in place the tools, and then given the tools, the thought is that neuroscientists, realizing that they had these tools available to them, could then pose better questions and hopefully use this as a way to gain more insight into better insight into how the brain works.
So how many people were on that committee, Emery?
There are like 15, 16 of us.
So one of the interesting things to me is I just felt as a field, we were incredibly lucky to have Emery on that committee, because it's rare that you have a high level kind of scientific committee that actually has a statistician on it, you know. And so if you look at the document that was produced, there's important components of that document that speak directly to statistics and how important statistics is in this overall effort.
Yeah, and I can honestly say, you know that I think the committee as a whole realized that data analysis is and was going to be an important bottleneck, and that we had to write and think explicitly about how we were going to give a prescription for getting over that bottleneck.
So let's talk a little bit more about the role of statisticians in this, because that's predominantly the theme of this discussion. Where do statisticians fit in? We touched on it, but in a more detailed sort of version of the story, how does statistics fit in with this whole big picture? And what are the expectations from the statistical part of the story?
So, to me, neuroscience is very broad endeavor. It involves many different tools, many different levels of analysis, from neuroimaging down to recordings from individual cells, down to synapses, and even molecular biology. And really, of course, every level generates data, and there are traditional roles for statistics and statisticians as the experts in data analysis. And as Emery said, a lot of the data that's being produced, even the microscopic, there's electron microscopic data, a lot of that's going to be really challenging. So it can be anything from high level down to very low level, and there's a lot of big data analysis challenges. So I would say those are what I would call traditional roles for statisticians. In addition, there's the strongly interdisciplinary part, where statisticians who are willing to make effort to learn something about the neuroscience are going to really have the biggest impact.
Right, and I would agree completely. I think that the statisticians who are going to have impact in neuroscience really have to become invested in the field, because there's so much which needs to be understood in order to design the methods appropriately, or to help design the experiments appropriately, so that we can extract do what statisticians do. And I think that the opportunities there are, the opportunities are enormous. But, and Rob and I were just talking about this a little while ago, one of the big barriers to entry seemingly is the level of understanding that's probably required in order to really begin to make a contribution. And the fact that historically this has not been an area where statisticians have worked. Let's say an area like genetics, historically statisticians have been in touch with that, but let's say that's not the case here. So one of the things that we have to do is come up with ways to help educate statisticians so they know enough neuroscience so that they can really be a neuroscience contributor and not just someone who's a dilettante.
There's another aspect of this which Emery and I were also just kicking around a little while ago, which is Emery's fortunate in two ways. One is that he had this overview of physiology because he's an anesthesiologist. But I feel kind of a kinship, partly because we are statisticians, but I think in statistics we also get to see a little bit of an overview. We're used to that. And what's really striking in neuroscience, it's different than some other disciplines. Neuroscience is inherently interdisciplinary. So you have psychologists and biologists who actually don't know very much about what each other is doing. And a statistician can come in and make some contributions to a biologically oriented lower level lab and maybe a psychologically oriented neuroimaging environment, and by learning a little bit about both can help make the bridge. And it's a bridge that everybody recognizes needs to be built. And there's going to be interesting conceptual things there, about how these different ways of thinking are needed. But there's also potentially statistical challenges. How do you deal with data at different levels? How do you sort of fuse data, different types of data? It's a great opportunity.
Which is a really good point that sort of takes me to the idea of training. I read the snippets of the Brain Initiative, and in it, you guys talk about, or the initiative talks about training the new generation of neuroscientists or quantitative and statisticians who have some understanding of the story of neuroscience. How do we make that happen? I can't think of many PhD programs that are designed for training neuroscientists who are equally quantitative. I mean, everybody takes a stats course, right? But that's the side. That's very general, very broad.
Right. So I think that's the. I think you've really hit the nail on the head. That's the problem that we have to address, and I think the answer. I think there are multiple answers. So if I look at how one of the things that I did to get involved in neuroscience, I went to Woods Hole and I took a month-long course in methods in computational neuroscience, and I used that to create an introduction for me to the field of computational neuroscience. So short courses which, let's say, thinking about training the statisticians now. So there are short courses where statisticians can basically learn about neuroscience and then you get involved in a problem and then use that as their introduction to the field. But one of the things that we need to do is to create those sorts of short courses which educate the community of neuroscience about statistics. We had one for a number of years at Woods Hole, which was the neuroinformatics course, which Partha Mitra founded along with David Kleinfeld, and both Rob and I were faculty in that course. And it's been discontinued for the last couple of years, but that's something which is very, very important to reestablish. And then those sorts of courses, not just in one location, but in multiple locations. And now in this age of online curricula, it should be very simple. Like if, for example, both Rob and I teach, at least 2 courses in statistics for neuroscientists or statistics for research in neuroscience, and making those materials available on the web, I think, is something else which we really, really have to do. And then the other idea, which actually just came up the other day when I was talking to one of my colleagues, who just sort of frankly admitted to me that she just felt she just did not know statistics. And we're actually thinking about setting up maybe a monthly seminar, or maybe every 2 week seminar, in which we actually just get someone in to discuss a problem, to educate the faculty. Because we can't pretend like the faculty know and the students don't. Because the ignorance about statistics actually permeates the whole field. And then those create perfect opportunities to have exchanges with statisticians who can learn the neuroscience at the same time that the neuroscientists are learning the statistics.
A couple more comments just to add to that. So let's not forget the meeting, SAN meeting, which is, I think, a great way for statisticians to kind of edge into neuroscience. We've been running, Emery and I started this meeting in, I think the first one was 2002.
2002.
And it's now going to SAN 7. It's been roughly every other year. And it's been a wonderful, wonderful meeting. I've had actually neuroscientists tell me that it was their favorite meeting, because it's such a broad range of different neuroscience that you hear about, and the focus is always on data analysis and what are the new kinds of data that are being created. So any statistician is very welcome to come to that. And one more thing I would like to mention is at Carnegie Mellon we have now 2 joint PhD programs with computational neuroscience. One is statistics and neural computation, it's called, and the other is machine learning and neural computation. And I hope that we can serve as something of a model for other places to start programs like this. It's actually not very difficult. I think there's lots of universities that would be very happy to have such a thing, and you kind of add on to an existing degree, effectively an extra year of study of neuroscience. And it's not as much as a real neuroscience degree would be, but it's probably enough to that, together with a commitment to do a interdisciplinary thesis with a real neuroscientist on the committee. That kind of thing would really, I think, is a viable option and would help a lot.
And Sam, I would just suggest another option. It's more common for biostatisticians to maybe do a postdoc after they finish their PhD program. and then look for a faculty position. But, one of the things which would be fantastic is if statisticians, after finishing their PhDs, who are interested in getting into neuroscience, did a postdoc in neuroscience, where they, became data analysts / experimentalists and really learned the ins and outs from the standpoint of the neuroscientist. And we can learn a lot from the physicists and the engineers because this is something which they typically do. I know a number of physicists or a number of engineers who've decided they wanted to become involved in neuroscience, and they've used the postdoc as a way to get that training, maybe one, perhaps two postdocs. The advantage of that is that they've had a chance to become very well trained in their discipline. In this case, it would be statistics, PhD level training in statistics, and then training deeply in neuroscience, and then going forward to look for a faculty position or a research position as a statistician who is indeed a card-carrying neuroscientist.
It takes some courage. I think, I've always admired Emery's courage for the path he took, but I feel like I've experienced some doubts myself. When I made a commitment to really be involved, you're leaving your safe environment. You're venturing into an area where it's not as known. You don't know really what to expect. But if you're interested, it's going to be very rewarding. And in the long run, it's a good sort of career move.
I think it's a very good career move, and I think the other thing that the statisticians will see very, very quickly, it's something that Rob alluded to initially, is that how far away the problems are, let me say it this way, how easy it is to propose better solutions right off the bat and sort of see ways to make long-term improvements. In other words, once you have a little bit more knowledge just of what neuroscience entails, it's not like you then have to go back and prove a lot of different theorems in order to figure out like where the new techniques should be. There are going to be some obvious things right off the bat which can be done. And many of them center around just this idea that Rob was talking about initially, which was that the data are dynamic and a high fraction of the methods are static.
Yeah, so, there's lots of, so to speak, there's going to be a fair amount of low-hanging fruit.
Right.
Now, maybe not as much in neuroimaging, although even there, I think there's some basic things that haven't been answered as much as you might think. But throughout a lot of neuroscience, there's a lot of new techniques for data collection. So yeah, there's going to be some very basic issues that have not been attacked very much. As one example that we mentioned in the white paper that we wrote for ASA on statistical responses to the Brain Initiative, experimental design. Traditionally, a kind of important part of the field that actually most students are not exposed to very much anymore because it hasn't been as exciting, but it has picked up steam in machine learning, and active learning. I think there are some really good opportunities, especially with things like optogenetics, where there's some dynamic, dynamic ways of collecting data that people haven't really figured out. Also, calcium imaging, when you can move a camera around to different locations, what's the optimal way to do that? Well, as you gain information, these are problems that people are only beginning to think about.
Right, and along those same lines, science, and I think just in general, statisticians should take that as an invitation to become more involved in fields, and I think neuroscience is certainly one of those fields. And then along those lines, just speaking in general, there's been a lot of discussion recently about the concern about lack of reproducibility. And if you think of if you read all the articles on lack of reproducibility, there are a number of editorials which have appeared in several of the major journals in the last few years discussing this point, it comes back. The basic issue, I thought about this because of what Rob just said about experimental design, the statistics just are not done correctly. It could mean because the experiment wasn't well designed to start with, the analysis wasn't properly carried out, and a lot of these things are quite basic. So I think one of the ways that we help eradicate that problem is we have more statisticians involved in an area like neuroscience, and also once we're there, we really work hard to educate folks on these basic paradigms, because this isn't occurring because they're missing some, some really highly technical point. It's failing, or this lack of reproducibility is occurring because a lot of basic points are being consistently missed.
Reproducibility is really, I'm glad you brought this up, because I was in ASA publication committee for a while, and this was one of the biggest concepts that we were talking about. So one of the things that we were thinking about it in terms of policy making was to ask for people to submit their data or their code, so that if I wanted to follow up on a paper's methods, I can reproduce that. But then at the same time, much data is protected because of many different layers of security and whatnot, and grants, and so how do you resolve this issue, protecting your data while being open and transparent and making sure that people can reproduce your results?
There are a lot of important issues there. As a matter of fact, the Committee on Applied and Theoretical Statistics, Kass, at the National Research Council is having a workshop on exactly this subject in about 10 days. So, I think, it's important to pay attention to it, and I think some things will start to happen.
Well, I think there are a couple of things that are already happening. So several of the journals, like, if I'm not mistaken, pretty much all the PLOS journals now, I know it's true for PLOS 1, they actually require you to submit the data along with the publication. And I think, having that access is going to help with the lack of reproducibility. I also think that a key part of, and I think there's also pressure which is going to come not from the journals, but also from the federal government, because a lot of us are able to do these experiments or conduct these analyses because we have the good fortune to receive federal funding. And ultimately, even though maybe we've thought up the experiments and we come with the ideas, the federal government is suggesting, and rightly so, that we have an obligation to share this information with the public at large or other scientists. And obviously certain grant mechanisms actually require a data sharing plan, and I think that that's going to become more a rule rather than an exception. I think the final point too, just on lack of reproducibility, is we really do, in other words, what keeps coming up time and time again is that everybody missed it. It made it through all of these levels from experiment to publication, submission of a manuscript, to then peer review, to editorial approval, to appearing in the literature, and now finding that we can't reproduce it. So I personally think that one of the biggest ways of rectifying that is we really do have to push statistical education across the board. I don't think there's any substitute for it. Because if that's occurring, what we're really saying is we have a collective ignorance of statistics. And it's only going to continue to be a problem to the extent that there's more and more data and more problems being analyzed. And I think what we have to do is make sure that we work hard to educate society as a whole on statistics.
By the way, there have been several papers in pretty high-level journals in neuroscience that have pointed out some of the very basic statistical flaws that come up and how prevalent they are in the neuroscience literature.
So let's go back to the role of a statistician. When I talk to people who are involved with analyzing neuronal data, predominantly there are two camps. There's the fMRI camp, and there's the people who study the brain at the cell level, being the single cell or multi-channel recordings. How do you reconcile the two groups and what comes out of their research? How do you see the connection between fMRI results and microelectrode results?
So I start with trying to understand the actual science. Anytime I've gotten really curious about something, I find that I have to read both. If you want to know about the activity in a certain, like what is going, somebody's recording from neurons in a certain area, and you want to know what's going on there, well, you need to look not only at the other recording papers for that area, but you also have to look at what the neuroimaging is saying. And you're going to want to know about issues of effectively networks, connectivity, which typically, so far, most of the neural recording is not addressing because we don't have multiple electrode arrays in different areas simultaneously very often, although that's just starting to really happen. And that's going to be a big area, I'm sure. But traditionally, the parts of neuroscience that have addressed multiple areas simultaneously has been more neuroimaging. That's where its strength is.
Right, and I agree completely with what Rob just said. I mean, that's both the challenge, but also the fun, I think, of neuroscience is that you go to the Society for Neuroscience meeting because you work on the problem at one level. Let's say you work on it at the systems level. And then you go there because you want to know what the fMRI folks are saying about this because, as Rob said, they've been able to record from multiple areas. Then you also want to go and find out what the molecular neuroscientists are saying because you want to find out what are they saying as far as the neurotransmitters that are affected, or how are the dendrites changing their properties, or what are the synapses doing. And then you intellectually are trying to integrate that information so that you can understand the question that you're after. Like in my case, it would be like understanding anesthesia. But I think that's the sort of situation that all neuroscientists basically find themselves in. So each one of those levels of analysis, each one of those scales needs to have robust, reliable statistical analysis so we know the information is valid and robust.
And just to be encouraging to people who might find that sort of overwhelming, you got to remember that it's a unique opportunity in neuroscience because neuroscience itself is already inherently interdisciplinary, and so the people in the field are typically very open. I have found them remarkably open to questions, to suggestions. You say, well, couldn't it work this way? And they kind of say, yeah, well, maybe. Maybe we should investigate that. And there are a lot of things they don't know, and they're happy to hear, what you might think of as naive suggestions that actually may be pretty plausible. So that's a big plus.
And it might make sense to put all of this in terms of the ever-evolving field of statistics, our discipline. When students come to me these days, they say they want to be data scientists. They talk about, do you have courses in analytics? Where's the machine learning? Where's the statistical learning? So there's the challenge of computation, of course, that has changed the way we do statistics. And I wonder, how do you see that? I mean, what is your reaction to calling us data scientists? It may or may not matter, but I'm excited and at the same time curious about these types of labels that come about.
So a couple of reactions. I mean, I think most statisticians, and not just statisticians, many computer scientists as well, are pretty wary of the faddish nature of this terminology. And as you said, on the other hand, it's creating opportunities and interest of a kind that we really haven't seen before. Big data, data science, it's this huge demand for statistics. I'm also in the machine learning department at Carnegie Mellon. I have a formal appointment there, and I have a lot of colleagues who are really computer scientists by training, and there's an increasing overlap between these fields. Some of the most exciting stuff in statistics is really at the interface with computer science, especially with large data. But at the same time, we come back to, I think, statistics offering a unique perspective on data science or machine learning. We have, in our discipline, have really focused on the connection between the scientific problem and the scientific inferences and the data analysis. How do we get to how well the data tell us an answer to a question? How strong is the information? How much knowledge do we have? And that's the one place where I think sometimes the more kind of straight computer science approaches without being informed by statistics are inadequate. We've seen many examples where there's some conclusion that's drawn based on some essentially algorithmic approach, and not only do you not know how well the information is really gathered, sometimes some of it's actually wrong on account of this because they've effectively ignored some basic statistical principles. So there's lots of opportunities there.
I agree completely. For example, before there were big data, there were just data. And it can't be the case now that we talk about big data, that all the things, the principles which have been built up over many years and have become the field of statistics are just jettisoned, and we adopt entirely new paradigms. I think the way to think about it is, with large data sets, there are now new problems. There are new statistical problems which can be cast in many of the same frameworks which we've used, time and time again. So I think that it just spells new opportunity. But what happens is that if there are not a lot of us, or sufficiently many of us, at the table, meaning statisticians, to help guide this dialogue, to help guide this thinking, then terms will evolve, approaches will be used, and we are frankly at risk for having incorrect inferences, which will be consequential. I mean, it's not benign. Bad things can happen. So I think that if anything, statisticians should feel more empowered to become part of this dialogue and participate in a real way to help solve a problem in some area. And certainly neuroscience is one of those areas where there's a tremendous need.
This is great because it takes me to, I was, in anticipation of this interview, I was reading two of your papers, the ones that you co-authored. One is the review paper you wrote for Journal of Neurophysiology in 2005 with Valerie, Statistical Issues in the Analysis of Neuronal Data. And the other one, it's a Nature Neuroscience paper in 2004 that you talk about sort of multiple spike train analysis. And obviously these days, what we have is multiple time series of spike trains and how to analyze them. I was wondering if you could, it would be great for this interview if you could give me a sense of evolutionary process of how statistical methods have changed, at least in the last decade or so. What were the prominent science problems, neuroscience problems, where we are, and maybe that helps us to see the future even better.
Well, can I start with one observation? Emery and I don't even remember how we came to this, but we had talked about issues of statistics and neuroscience and decided to run a workshop, the SAND workshop, Statistical Analysis of Neural Data, in 2002. And it's amazing to me to see the evolution that has occurred since then. I don't know how much credit we can take for that, but certainly the field has evolved dramatically. So when that started, we tried to just have people come in and articulate the problems in neurophysiology and what kind of data they were getting. And they were using only the most primitive methods. And today, it's completely different in the sense that, I mean, there's still plenty of people who could be using better statistics, but there are also a lot of people who are doing very good, solid, I would say more or less state-of-the-art work, and they're very knowledgeable about point process methodology and so forth, which to me is very gratifying. So I think we've come a long way.
Yeah, I would agree. I think a lot of progress has been made, and I think that this is where you wished that the neuroscientists had basic statistics courses sooner, because there were two things that I realized when I first got involved in neuroscience. One was what we mentioned earlier, that people were using static methods to look at dynamic data, and the second thing was specifically for systems neuroscience experiments. You really had a stimulus that you were putting into a system you were measuring a response. So at a very basic level, the principal model of analysis should be something involving a regression. And that often wasn't done. And so then if you could just put in place a way to do regressions and have the things on the left-hand side of the equation be, let's say, like spikes, in this case point processes, the field could move ahead fairly readily. So I mean, and I would like,
and that's what it took.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, and it's not only just sort of realizing that and then sort of making, kind of telling people that, but then the software really have to be there so that people can actually do these sorts of things and what have you. And then it still takes some training and then some re-emphasis to make sure that that even other problems which don't appear to be, let's say these kind of stimulus response experiments, they are, and that they are analyzed, the same way. In other words, really appreciating the extent to which the paradigm, the paradigm applies. So I think that has evolved quite a bit. Rob was mentioning earlier, neuroimaging, and probably that's an area where statistics are used extensively. But we have a long way to go there to, I think, really realize the true potential. And one of the difficulties there is that if we're thinking about functional neuroimaging, let's say that comes from fMRI, the signal-to-noise ratio on the problem is very low to begin with. And now you have a very, very complex experiment executed over many subjects. And now you have very complex anatomy and physiology that you're trying to track. So one of the things which can help in situations like that is to try to exploit the anatomy, meaning like the spatial information, and to exploit the temporal information, the evolution of the signals over time, to help increase the signal-to-noise ratio and improve, improve the recovery of information. So that's very easy.
And this gets back to this whole data fusion issue potentially, right?
Exactly. Right.
Using different modalities to help.
Right, and that's very easy to state. It's very easy to state. I'm not going to pretend like it's going to be easy to solve. But just having it in that conceptual framework might be something that maybe the neuroscientists can't solve, but in talking with statisticians who are quite adept at some of these methods, they could solve or certainly help improve.
But by the way, along those lines, let me add one other twist. Is one thing that gets ignored in neuroimaging for the most part is intersubject differences, subject-to-subject variability in the structure of the brain. And it's ignored because you can do a certain amount of stuff without worrying about it. But taking that problem seriously, there are very few people have done. I know of one. I mean, Tim Johnson and Tom Nichols have a couple of papers between them that have tried to grapple with this in a Bayesian framework in an interesting, what I consider to be an interesting way. But they've really just started, and I think there's a lot more to do to really look at intersubject variability. And certainly NSF is aware of this. There was recently a call for, I think it was through cognitive psychology, for inventive research that would try to deal with subject-to-subject variability, individual differences. But there's no question that scientifically it's really interesting. And everybody's brain is a little bit different.
And important, because the experiments are very, very expensive. They require a lot of time, and you want to extract the most information from them that you possibly can.
But the whole, the starting point always was to, kind of just align everybody's brains, which is, again, it's fine for certain gross questions, but that at some level it's just not right.
And this is where that design of experiment.
Right, correct.
You're talking about between subjects variation and within each subject's space, isn't it? So,
right, but then the part that then makes it really interesting, and I think a very, very inviting challenge for us, is that anatomy is non-trivial. In other words, the physiology there is non-trivial. So that's what I was saying. It's very straightforward to state conceptually, and now to really solve it means that the statistician has to be really, really interested in getting that anatomy straight, getting the physiology straight, so that you define accurately what the covariates are that you're using to stratify or to actually parse out the variance and sort of appropriately attribute it.
And just to emphasize this, in a typical fMRI voxel, I believe there are millions of neurons. And it's not as if they're homogeneous. There's probably at least a dozen different types of neurons in that area, maybe more. And they're not subtly different, they're grossly different. And so it's sort of amazing that people have been able to learn anything from it. But they have, and so it's great, but you know, being cognizant of all of that detail is also really a good idea.
Right.
Which is interesting because it takes me back to what Emery said about that regression problem. When I was Rob's student, we were doing regression in a sense. All we were doing is we were looking at spikes and we were regressing that against time. But that was a very important problem at the time, to smooth the PSTH histograms. But at the same time, this problem is extremely complex. There is anatomy, there is the subject's behavior, and these are all covariates potentially in that regression problem. There's the time element, and there's the space element, and now we're talking about subject-to-subject variability. So the more we talk about it, the harder it becomes, even though the foundational problem is that regression model.
Right. But if you think about it, sorry, but if you think about it, if we don't step up to the plate and solve it, given that we've been able to pose it that way, no one else is. And what will be available is just, you know, an ad hoc approximation, which in certain circumstances may work quite well, but it can't work universally.
So tell me about the textbook you wrote.
So, as with some of our other writing, really this just grew out of conversations that Emery and I had repeatedly. And I would just say that, you know, I enjoy taking the insights that Emery has and trying to figure out how to really make them effective on paper and to participate in kind of the precise formulation of the ideas. And we go back and forth a lot as these ideas are getting developed. So that's really the way that book evolved as well. To be honest, my first effort was, I was thinking of writing a book and based on my teaching, and the first I believe draft chapters that I showed Emery way long ago, he immediately pushed me in a different direction. They were oriented toward neurobiologists only, who would be completely intimidated by the math. And while I actually still want to write a book like that, what he said was, you know, you should give them some detail. You don't be afraid of saying how a confidence interval works. Don't be afraid of, you know, spelling out a little bit of this, you know, what's an expectation. Show them a little bit, and that just took it in a completely different direction. And I was very grateful for that because I like the way it went, where, you know, the idea is to, on the one hand, give very intuitive and data-driven methods and explanations, but on the other hand, provide some level of rigor so that someone can appreciate it even if they want to see the detail. So it's an unorthodox book for many reasons. One of them is that there's a lot of methods in that book, and if you just look superficially at the titles of the chapters, it might just look like a statistics book that's a little idiosyncratic, but not much. But actually, it's very different because there's nothing in that book that isn't practical. Everything there is there for a specific reason where we have to solve a data analysis problem. And otherwise, it wouldn't be there. And it's full of examples of that. And it's sort of merged together a traditional math stat course with a traditional basic statistics course, but then overlaid, you know, 100 different examples of statistics and neuroscience.
Just so the record's clear, I mean, I added some contributions to this book. I mean, Rob was like the mastermind behind this whole thing, you know, like pulling it together, and also like laying out the conceptual framework, but also then saying, like, you know, we got to do this. Because, I mean, there are probably a gazillion books out there which have been written in people's minds, but this one actually came to fruition because, as you know, Rob is someone who makes things happen, and also made it happen in a way that it's I think it is very, very accessible. Does it reach all the audiences we'd like to reach? No. But I think the one thing that Rob was very, very good about doing was saying we have to put a stake in the ground somewhere, and then we can move to things which are more mathematically dense for a certain audience, and maybe things which are maybe less mathematically dense for like another audience, in sort of subsequent publications. But I think it's very important to have a book in the field for neuroscience data analysis, which is written by statisticians, because we probably know a little bit more neuroscience than most statisticians, but also the points that we raise from a statistical standpoint, statisticians should feel comfortable coming and talking to us about them, so it can help be an entree, into the field.
And I'll add one more thing. One of the real target audiences for me in the end was people who are generally considered sort of computational neuroscientists, although that term is itself very broad. So it's the people who do data analysis in an experimental lab. And they are typically not statisticians. They're almost never statisticians. This is one of our issues. We need to get more statisticians in there. But they are usually trained in something like physics. It's probably the most common discipline, sometimes engineering. And they're not afraid of math. And they do need to know the principles. So, I mean, the fact that Emery pushed me to go and add the principles was crucial, because, I mean, I could give you examples. I don't want to be specific here, but there are methods out in the neuroscience literature, for example, that are interesting methods, and they maybe accomplish something, but they purport to test a hypothesis without being able to state the hypothesis.
Right.
And at that point, you say, well, then what exactly are you doing? And the people who did this. When we teach, let's say, hypothesis testing, we very quickly run into the conceptual difficulties, right? In all of our basic classes. You have exactly the same conceptual difficulties, even if you're a PhD in physics. It's not obvious, this logic, and it's very easy to miss a really basic point like that. So, to me, this is one of the things that we tried to accomplish is to get those ideas in there.
One thing I want to ask, as we were talking about the evolution of statistics in neuroscience, was the idea of interpretability of our techniques and models. We're talking about networks these days, and it's getting more and more sophisticated. We're recording more and more cells. Suppose Emery, I come to you tomorrow morning and I say I have this fancy model that will help you to understand how neurons talk to each other. It's really elaborate, computation, beautiful, all that jazz. What do you want to see in such a model? What do you want to learn from a very sophisticated model? And I give you a motivation. I go to talks and I see fairly elaborate statistical techniques that are very, very interesting computationally and methodologically from a statistical perspective. But I'm having a hard time understanding what they mean in terms of the science part of the story.
Right. No, I understand what you mean. So here's the thing. As I said before there were big data, there were data. And so my thinking about this in some ways is very, very simple. I mean, I think that, I like to think about, the box-Tukey paradigm of iterative model building, where you go through a process of analyzing data in some sort of preliminary fashion, you formulate some very specific questions, you go after it and model it, you try to do some model fitting, you see how good the model fits, then if it is, maybe you can go on and make an inference and make a decision. And I think that that's very, very important, especially when you come up with these complex questions. And so as soon as I put the complex model that you described against those questions, I often find out that major parts in this paradigm have been skipped, right? The question isn't well posed, for example, right? Or the question is talking about maybe more than one thing. Do we really know the model describes the data? And there are many ways in which this can be sorted out. One way are like in sort of the classic goodness of fit techniques that most of us would think about, just going back to plotting the data, looking at the residuals, if that were possible. But then other ways are certainly possible as well, and then there are paradigms which can be used sort of simultaneously. For example, using our statistics paradigm to robustly say that some sort of feature is there in the data, and then going to an experimental paradigm, going to a modeling paradigm where you come up with some idea as to how those features are generated, thinking maybe specifically about oscillations. And now, then imagining doing an experiment that actually goes to verify that the model for the oscillation holds. So you can imagine going through a process like that, and if after that sort of process you find, oh, the inference seems very, very plausible, then you say, oh yeah, then I think that this is probably a reasonable conclusion to follow from this. But I think that, again, it just goes back to, just because the data set got to be large and the model got to be complex, the basic paradigm shouldn't be jettisoned. And in fact, we should hold on to them even more tenaciously, because they're going to guide us through these complex problems where it seems like, oh, this is so overwhelming.
I would just add that as a general point about statistics, I'm a big believer in case studies, and that a lot of these questions that you're asking really cannot be answered in the abstract. They have to be answered on a case-by-case basis. And the point, I started years ago, I think it was, I forget when it was, probably 1990 or so, I started the case studies in Bayesian statistics. And the point there was to learn about how to do statistics better. We're not even talking about advancing the science. How to do statistics better by taking a case study seriously and seeing how do the methods really, which aspect of this modeling you're asking about or this methodology really help solve a problem. And in order to do that, you have to ask a well-posed question. As Emery said, sometimes that's the very part that gets skipped. People jump to an algorithm before they really think about the question itself. So yeah, I'm a big believer in dealing with a very specific, concrete setting, and pushing on that, and asking whoever's involved, so how, what kind of question can you answer? What kind of new experiment can you run? There's another thing that happened to me when I decided to get involved in neuroscience. I had actually a moment of epiphany when I was talking to a specific person and that I still remember really well. And it was not, I remember it because I had heard this from a few different people, but somehow when I talked to this guy, it made sense. I was trying to describe exactly what you were saying. I had this somewhat, back then, it was 10 years ago, but a somewhat complicated, more sophisticated modeling idea for multineuronal data than was usually being used. And I was trying to describe what I thought we could do as statisticians to this guy who was an experimentalist. And he just turned to me and he said, so what experiment should I do? And at first I think, well, I'm not about experiments, I'm about data. But then I realized that's exactly the point. The point is, your method should give someone the ability to ask a question they've never asked before. And when you get there, then you've really got something.
And extract information that they haven't been able to extract,
right.
Previously.
That's very good. So, okay, so let's spend a few minutes on your how you became the person you are in terms of your work. And Emery, let me start with you. I mean, like everybody else, when I read your resume, I'm just fascinated. You're a statistician, you're an anesthesiologist. How does this work? How did you become involved in these two seemingly different worlds?
Well, I think the answer is that I did the MD PhD program, at Harvard.
Wait, can I push you back? Start a little earlier. You started out in languages, right?
Yeah, that's true. So I started majoring in Romance languages in college, and because that was the thing I was good at. That was what I figured I would get my undergraduate degree in. I even thought of the idea of getting a PhD in that, but I didn't want to go into medical school. And then I switched into economics and eventually into applied mathematics. I switched into economics because my roommates were economics concentrators. And they were quoting people like John Kenneth Galbraith and Otto Eckstein and Paul Samuelson. It seemed like they knew how the world worked, and I wanted to say important things too. So I said, I'm going to switch to economics. And I can honestly say that, sometime between sophomore and junior year, I realized that the really core thing was really the statistics in all of this. And I decided to switch into applied mathematics and make statistics, my focus. I decided to go to medical school. I went and I figured out that anesthesiology is what I wanted to go into. And I actually didn't worry about the problem of trying to put them together. trying to put statistics together with anesthesiology. And for a long time, I practiced as an anesthesiologist, and I had a research program and, well, eventually in neuroscience, but initially in circadian rhythms, but, you know, looking at interesting statistical problems with no connection whatsoever to anesthesiology. And then as I learned more neuroscience and I would go to these meetings, people would say to me, oh, you know, that was an interesting talk you gave on those techniques you're using, the state-space stuff. I hear an anesthesiologist tell me how that works. And I go, we don't know how that works. And people would go, whoa, oh, you do this every day and you have no idea how it works? And I go, yeah, well, that's cool, you know, that's the way it is. And after saying that a few times and actually hearing what I was saying, I said, that sounds kind of stupid if you're telling neuroscientists you're doing these things to people and you have no idea how it works. So after a bit, I started, you know, doing research in the neuroscience of anesthesia. It was easier to do than you might imagine. I mean, it was very easy to get a group of people together to start working on these sorts of things. It is an intriguing problem. And so now it turns out that a lot of the data that I work on analyzing are data we generate in our own experiments, our own experiments in anesthesia, which involve humans, involve rats. We even have a paradigm in non-human primates. So I mean, that's where how I've gotten to where I am now. But there were two things that I think really made it possible. One was when I sat down and I read that there were mechanisms to get people who weren't quote-unquote neuroscientists into neuroscience. I mentioned like the course in Woods Hole that I took. And because the neuroscience is so interdisciplinary, everybody realized that they were all touching a part of a very large elephant. And then I could bring something to the table like right away because of just realizing that there are these problems, these data analysis problems that were being solved with suboptimal methods, essentially. And I used each encounter with maybe a neuroscientist to learn more about the brain. Because what could be a better way to learn about it than when you're talking about that specific problem? And then over time, it turns out I ended up learning a lot about the brain, a lot about different parts of the brain, and being able to integrate information, my understanding about different parts of the brain, which, interestingly enough, helped me tremendously when I went to study anesthesia, because anesthesia is a global phenomenon. It affects all the brain and the central nervous system when it's administered to patients who are having, you know, surgical procedures or, you know, potentially traumatic diagnostic procedures. So it seemed like I wasn't preparing to study anesthesia, but in point of fact I was. And then again, data analysis is everywhere, you know, and what's a better place to study, to do data analysis problems than in an area that, you practice in. I mean, and I practice, every Tuesday I'm in the operating room, taking care of patients. So, that's kind of in a nutshell how I got into this.
But the part that you skip, and it's fascinating, is you're training in statistics, and then you go for medicine, medical science, and you just become a physician. It's just, when I got my PhD, I said to Rob, see you later. It's just fantastic. So how does this work? It's just committing yourself to years of training and all that jazz. It's just...
No, but I signed up for both at the same time. I knew I wanted to do the MD PhD program. So when I finished college, I knew I wanted to do that. So I actually went to France for a year to buff up my math, to learn even more mathematics, and I came back and was admitted to the MD PhD program at Harvard. So I was committed to the long term. I didn't have a job until I was 35, sort of thing. So I realized...
That's what I'm saying. It takes courage,
yeah.
But you know what? There's a big payoff.
Yeah, it's one of the things that medicine teaches you, and I think this is something which I'd love to instill in my statistics students in particular. Medicine teaches you that you have to learn about a lot. You have to learn a little about a lot of things. You have to learn about anatomy. You have to learn anatomy, physiology, the pathophysiologies of different systems, and these sorts of things. But you learn that you can do that. You can sit down and study these sorts of things. I think the same applies to statisticians wanting to get into neuroscience. You can study and become expert in an area, or certainly have sufficient depth in an area to make a contribution it doesn't necessarily have to be years. We talked about ways of doing that, because when I came back to neuroscience, when I came back to take on neuroscience as a research area, I was essentially calling on the neuroscience that I had learned as a medical student. I mean, it wasn't like I'd done a PhD in neuroscience, right? So, but it was just realizing that I had touched the field as a part of my medical training, and that I could now build on that. And having the good fortune of being like in this area, in the Boston area, and people like Matt Wilson around here, start talking to him, and then having and Lauren Frank and explaining to me the anatomy, the neurophysiology, you know, I was able to, you know, come up to speed and start, and then that's what you learn. You always have to go to the meetings to learn the new stuff. You know, it's not like, oh, something has been proven and you just use that. It changes every few months, and you have to go to the meetings to learn what's new. And that's something which is crucial for statisticians who want to become involved in this field in a serious way.
So how does that inform you? You can't be an anesthesiologist on Monday and a statistician on Tuesday, but even though you work in the departments, how do you operate?
So like tomorrow's Tuesday, so tomorrow I'm in the operating room. You know, I got a page just on Friday telling me about the cases I'm going to be doing. Tonight I'll discuss those cases with the resident. We'll make, you know, the usually 2 rooms that I'm supervising, we'll make a plan for that patient's, you know, anesthesia, and with that patient's anesthesia, usually, you know, 2 to 3, maybe 3 to 4 cases per room. And, you know, go there and, you know, administer anesthesia to these patients, teach the residents both about the neuroscience of the brain and also the practical things that come up in taking care of those particular patients, you know, on that day. I mean, I've been doing this for like 25 years now, so I, you know, have a little bit of practice at it, you know. And then, like, Wednesday, I'm back over here at MIT, so I'm at the hospital at MGH for the anesthesia. I'm back over here at MIT, I have to teach my graduate course in statistics, you know, so Tuesday night, you know, I've got to get the lectures together and all this sort of thing. So literally it's just going back and forth. And then the interesting thing is, there are now a large class of problems that sit right at the intersection. You know, for example, we've been using our various dynamic methods to track brain states under anesthesia. We've come with new ways of monitoring the brain of patients who are receiving anesthesia. So this is me applying the dynamic methods to things which, you know, I care about and do as a clinical neuroscientist, you know, taking care of patients who are having surgery. Or we're working on ways to develop control systems which could precisely control, read EEG in real time and control the patient's anesthetic state. So very straightforward in terms of what's necessary from a statistical standpoint, but then making it work in this context, you know, for anesthesia, you know, very, very challenging. So now, I mention this just to say that now there's a large set of things which truly lie in the intersection, you know, which are statistical issues, which have research importance, which have actually perhaps immediate clinical importance, that I have the good fortune, you know, to work on.
I got to add a story. I got to add one. I got to tell one of Emery's stories, and this may or may not survive the interview process. But he was telling me one time that a surgeon was giving him a hard time about a particular anesthesia issue, and you know, surgeons are notorious for being kind of, you know, single-minded and thinking that they know everything. And I don't think they were going to tell Emery, you know, like what's the best thing to do in this situation. So he said, well, actually, we can understand this from a simple pharmacokinetics model. Why don't we just write out the differential equation here? And there's a constant here. We can look that up. We can look that up in this book over here. Let's get the constant. Let's solve this equation, and let's see what happens. And he says he wrote it out for him right there on the page. He said, now see, this is going to tell us. This tells us what we should be doing here.
Well, it's helpful to bring science as opposed to just opinion to the OR. Let's just put it that way, you know. You know, so.
So Rob, your early work is really theoretical. I mean, when you were in Chicago, you studied with Steve Stigler. In the first book you wrote, Geometry of Maximum Likelihood, I must admit, I've carried it with me from office to office. I haven't read it.
Yeah, I have too. I've been meaning to read that. Yeah.
So how did you, I mean, what happened? How did you get involved with applications in neuroscience?
So you got to know one thing about me. I started as a lab guy. I worked in 3 different labs in high school and college. Started as a lab guy. I worked in 3 different labs in high school and college. They were not neuroscience labs, but they were biomedical labs, and things like I knew how to do tissue culture. I was a lab tech, essentially. I could do tissue culture. I learned how to do electron microscopy, from the killing the animal all the way through taking, developing the film in the dark room, and I loved it. And then, of course, when I was in college, though, I kind of remembered I loved math, and I decided to major in math. And then I went back to one of the labs, and during the summer, realized that there were all these people in this lab who could not understand the statistics they were doing. And I picked up a basic statistics book and just read it and helped them figure out what they needed to do. And that's how I got into statistics. So then, I developed a strong interest in the theory when Paul Meyer actually was my academic advisor before Steve Stigler was my PhD advisor. And when I was done, I talked to him about advice about what the next step should be, and he said, well, Rob, you have to realize, and this was in 1980 when I was finishing my PhD, you have to be either theoretical or applied. You can't be both. You have to choose. And I think at that moment in time he was only telling me the truth, and he knew that I really liked applications because I had still kind of gravitated toward that in graduate school, but. I said, well, if I have to choose, I'm going to be theoretical. And so that's what I did up until essentially when I was a full professor. And then I was really allowed to do what I wanted to do, and I always wanted to do applications. I looked around for applications, and it took me a couple of years before, by coincidence, Carl Olson, I don't mind saying now, I actually was on his recruitment tenure committee, and I saw his papers, and I thought they were really interesting when he was being hired. He was being recruited from NIH to Carnegie Mellon. But as much as I thought they were interesting, I also thought we could do more with the data. So after he arrived, I went and talked to him. He was incredibly forthcoming and eager to have collaboration, as I think most neuroscientists are in my experience. And actually the problem that I wanted to solve is the one that you ended up working on. They were doing a NOVA in a context where there was so much more information. Why not use all of the information and do essentially a functional version of a NOVA? And you had to derive new likelihood ratio statistics and tests and so forth in order to solve it. But it was something that we ended up solving rather nicely, I think.
But so 2 points on that. So Rob wasn't just doing theory; he was actually one of the most cited statisticians at the time, so it wasn't like he was just doing theory for the sake of theory. And then even when he was doing theory for the sake of theory, literally just a few months ago, I was mentioning to him this idea that I had just discovered about orthogonality in GLM models. He goes, oh yeah, I'm aware of that. That's in my book. Okay. See, that's the benefit of having a theoretician around, because you can make these connections.
I will say I think it's great for people to learn an application deeply, as we've been talking about, but there's no substitute for really strong statistical training.
I agree.
I don't know. I think, honestly, I might have been happier if I had gotten into this area a lot earlier. But certainly having good, solid training is there's no substitute for that.
I agree with that completely, but I also know, at least for me personally, I couldn't have gotten into it until there were questions which sort of then drove me to try to solve something, and they had to be questions that were indeed viscerally engaging.
But there's something very interesting in what Rob said. He said, until you became a full professor and you found the liberty and time and authority perhaps to move around. I think partly you're talking about the tenure process as well.
Yes.
They're just there. 30 years ago, I suspect if you didn't publish in statistical journals predominantly, it would have been really hard to get tenure wherever you were in terms of being recognized as a tenured professor in statistics. Suppose you had a brilliant person who only published in Nature, but it was the failure of the statistics department in 1980, 81 or so when you started. This is another part of the story that is fascinating to me, that how much the field has evolved. Would you give tenure? Would you recommend a colleague for a tenure only affiliated with the stats department, computer science department, machine learning department, but only publishes in science papers.
Well, so I think I have sort of mixed feelings about this. I still think that it's important for statisticians to bring things back to statistics. And in that sense, I do think it's perfectly legitimate for any department of either statistics or biostatistics to expect some publications in statistics. Having said that, I will say that I think our field is very conservative about this, and this is the impetus for the What is Statistics article that we wrote in the American Statistician. It was partly a complaint about our field for being too conservative. I think we go too far in that direction, actually, surprisingly, because we are so applied. Nonetheless, we insist, I think that the balance, we are often reluctant to give a lot of value to someone who is very, very good on the applied end and does only a tiny bit on the purely statistical end.
Right, no,
I think that's still the case. It's better than it used to be, but it's still the case.
Right, and it's a real challenge now because, where I am I'm in the Institute for Medical Engineering and Science, which is by design a very interdisciplinary institute here at MIT. And we grapple with this issue all the time when it comes time to evaluate new faculty, when it comes time to evaluate faculty for tenure. We have to work really, really hard to make sure we understand the scientific impact of what the person is doing. And it means really moving outside your comfort zone. It means really spending time studying things that you many times will not know, a lot about. But I think if we're going to really have the scientific contributions, which I think we can have, like in neuroscience and other fields, I think we do have to move out of this comfort zone. I think it's very, very important because it could be the case that you could design a new method, and it's important to do theory, and it might lay fallow in the theoretical literature for a long period of time. Whereas it could be as simple as helping design an experiment properly, which then makes it possible for a new medication to be shown to be effective and have tremendous impact, and something in between. So I think that we have to learn to be open to both. I think to both possibilities, because I have gone and benefited from those seemingly esoteric points that are just sitting in the literature that someone wrote there and go, aha, I can use this, right? And then we've all benefited from knowing that a well-designed study showed that an important therapy was indeed delivering the results it was supposed to deliver.
The other aspect of this, too, is that I think it's sometimes hard to appreciate for all of us how much effort goes into an applied piece of statistical work. We forget, let me put it that way, because if we focus on the statistics alone, sometimes it doesn't look that impressive. It's a small increment over something else that was done. But the amount of effort to get there, what you're not told is all of the false leads that the person went through, right? Trying to do this or trying to do that, and realizing that was the wrong question, they misunderstood. There's so many things that have to be grappled with when you take a problem seriously. And that's the one weakness of our process, I think, is that we often I think in many cases we don't fully recognize the accomplishment. Now again, this is changing. I think a lot of places. I think Carnegie Mellon does pretty well with this, for example, because we tend to judge the quality of the work as opposed to the specific statistical contribution. But it's an ongoing issue.
Yeah, no, very much so. And I think that there's a class of what I would call theoretical problems, which I find, very, very intriguing. And they're the ones which come out of having worked with applied problems, and now you realize, aha, if I could solve this theoretical problem, right, that would really move the field forward. And what I like about those sorts of theoretical problems is they put constraints out there that you wouldn't think up yourself. I mean, we think of the constraints that are going to allow us to get the convergence result that we want. But nature and science, put up constraints that are there because of the problems that they're creating for us, that we're seeing, that are being posed before us. And I think when we can identify and solve those types of theoretical problems, that brings back new ideas to statistics, and also helps move the disciplines that we're collaborating with forward.
So, in the interest of time, I have two questions. One of them is that, in your vision, your understanding, what is the next big problem for statisticians who are involved in neuroscience that they need to solve? What is the next big question that we need to address? Partly we have talked about it, but I think as a wrap, it might be.
I mean, it's a little parochial, perhaps, in terms of in the sense that I'm myself interested in solving aspects of it. But I personally think that one of the issues, is by no means the only one, involves timing. That we need to have better methods for dealing with large numbers of interacting time series, essentially, and we need to have ways of better analyzing, understanding the collective behavior.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely, and I also think that a related issue is, I mean, you're familiar with the way statisticians, we analyze data and make inferences. There are other inference paradigms, and so one of the inference paradigms that the modelers use is that they will construct a model and they'll simulate it and they'll generate data which looks something like experimental data, and then they'll make the inference that the model is reasonable. So there's this, and so that wouldn't seem like an inference framework to us, but it's been shown in many cases that's a very reliable inference framework because they've been able to make predictions that you can actually verify. So this relationship between like dynamical systems modeling, as I just described it, and then analysis with dynamical or stochastic statistical procedures is a very, very interesting area. And I think the more we can understand the links and the relationships between those paradigms, because they come up time and time again in neuroscience, because we have dynamic data and many of the neuroscience systems can be modeled. And I think if we can come up with ways to close the loop between those two paradigms, I think the field of neuroscience would move ahead tremendously. Modeling would be helped as well, and sort of just paradigms for scientific inference would be more clearly stated.
Right, so my last question is, any word of wisdom for a younger generation of people who are watching this show or this interview?
I mean, I would only say, to reiterate what we said before, which is have the courage to go for it. We're talking about statistics and neuroscience. Neuroscience is great because on the surface it's hopelessly complicated, and every time you think you understand something, there's more. And there's been a lot of progress. And there's a lot of ways statisticians can help make that progress. So, yes, it takes some courage, it takes some initiative, but it's really worthwhile.
Yeah, and I would, from my standpoint, I would love to see, more PhD statisticians who come into neuroscience because after doing their PhD, they've done a postdoc and they've spent some time, being a neuroscientist and then combining the expertise. I think they would have tremendous impact on the field because, that level of sort of PhD rigor that they could bring to thinking about the problems in neuroscience, once coupled with the neuroscience background, would just be an invaluable combination. And we see it time and time again. Many of the engineers, many of the physicists who've done, exactly like that, and they're leading figures in neuroscience. And there's no reason why some of those leading figures couldn't be statisticians as well. Because arguably now, the ball is in our court because everybody admits that the next big challenge in front of us is the challenge of analyzing large amounts of data.
And I can attest to that. I mean, years ago when I started working with Rob, my background was all stats and math. And one day you said, you gotta go learn some neuroscience. So I got that Gazzaniga book, the intro book, and you said you have to present chapter 8 or 9, whatever, on motor cortex. I didn't even know how to say these fancy words. You know, the terminology was I was alien to the whole thing. But once I started reading those, I realized this is a fascinating area. This is a lot of fun. I didn't have the clergy. I had to do this because, you know, you had to give me a grade. But on the other hand, I'm glad you did that. And you know, I think what I'm reading from your comments is that people have to initiate that and have the courage to go for it.
Yeah, and you see, I just have to add a point on this, because I see this all the time. You see, different graduates, different disciplines have different sociology in the training of their graduate students. Okay? I see this all the time, because we're in an interdisciplinary sort of environment here at this institute at MIT. You know, the physics graduate students come in with the idea that there's nothing they can't figure out, right? Because they've learned all the fundamental laws, and you know, this just has to be some application of it. I just have to figure out which one or some combination of it. And engineers come into this with the idea that, okay, I can make anything work, right? So they basically, just psychologically, they feel they can do this because they have principles which they know can apply, all right? So our graduate students should feel empowered exactly the same way. And it's a very, very simple tenet. It should just basically say, there's no uncertainty I can't quantify. It should be exactly that, right? And the same thing. And arguably now, in the big data era, that should really be the mantra.
It requires a shift, though. Our departments have to shift. They have to pivot.
Right.
Because we have to stop beating the students over the head with all the things that can go wrong. Which are important, but they're not the central message. It's been too much of the central message, which actually serves to intimidate students.
Can you elaborate more on that?
Yeah, and this was, I think, part of what we said in that "What is Statistics" paper in the American Statistician. It's that the students that we see coming through statistics are often very cautious. I would say excessively cautious, and it's because what we've put in front of them is, you know, here's the failure of the assumption. Here's where this one doesn't work. Here's where that one doesn't work. And they're always nervous that they're going to do something where there's some assumption wrong and they're going to make a mistake. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but I think there's more of that mindset as opposed to I can do it no matter what, which is what the computer scientist or the engineer or the physicist thinks.
Right.
And I don't want to turn all the statisticians into something else, because it's good to have some caution. But we've kind of gone, our tradition has pushed too far in that direction. We need to go closer to a real balance.
Right, I'd love them to have a little bit more of this chutzpah, if you would.
Right.
You know, so for example, we're starting up some experiment. We're starting up what is, I think, a very interesting signal processing question, but we need to do some new experiments. And one of my students who's in this Institute for Medical Engineering and Science, she just says, okay, I'll do the experiments. You know, just, you know, no problem, I'll just go and learn whatever it is I have to learn. You know, I've never done them before, but that's okay. You know, not even giving it a second thought, because she wants to be sure that the caliber of the data is ensured by the fact that she's done the experiments and she can vouch for it, right? And then just the idea, and she wants to do the methods the right way, right? She wants to control the whole problem. And I would love to see us imbue our graduate students, meaning our statistics graduate students, with that same level of chutzpah.
All right. Emery, Rob, what a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. And, this was fantastic. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks for